Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to a study of Introduction to Family and Kinship in India. This is the first lecture of this course, and to lay out what we will be discussing in this course, we want to look at how the conceptualization of kinship and family in India has come about through a conversation with classical theory and with contemporary theories on India and elsewhere in the world. Please note that this course is going to engage with both classical contemporary theories within India and those outside. We will look at specifically cultures beyond India, such as in Africa and in South America and in America. The aim of looking at such an exercise is to engage in a cross-cultural examination of the idea of kinship and family. To begin with, what is kinship? Kinship, when understood in its basic terminology, refers to the idea of family and relatives. We understand kinship as the relations based on blood and marriage. That is the most basic definition of kinship. As we go deeper into the study of kinship and family, you will realize that it is not as simple as that. Kinship and family are complicated ideas which cover vast areas of engagement, both in India and abroad. This introductory lecture lays out certain important theoretical ideas. We look at classical theory, especially the theory written in the 1950s and 60s and before, and we look at the kind of engagement classical theory has brought on in the influence of contemporary analysis. Let us begin by looking at two important ideas within kinship, one of descent and the other of alliance. Let me tell you first the idea of how kinship engaged with certain symbols and notions of defining kin. If you look at the triangle and the circle, the triangle refers to this is the most basic symbol within kinship. Why are these symbols being used in the study of kinship? The idea is to develop a more theoretical and yet objective study of relationships. Is it possible to objectively study social relationships? Yes. As per classical anthropological theory, it was easy and important to study relationships based on certain objective criteria. To begin with, these are the four important symbols. We will further bifurcate and look at these as we go along in this lecture. So, how does kinship and family understand its orientation? Classical theory within kinship and family decides that the idea of blood and marriage is the foundation to the study of human relationships. Within such an idea, to map it on the basis of certain symbols and structures is important so that a cross-cultural and universal analysis of the same can be undertaken. Now, by transposing the symbol of the man in terms of a triangle and a woman in terms of a circle means that you are designating certain important ideas within kinship and family. The most important being that a man and woman are the basic units of social relationships, and the coming together of these two units is the basis of how kinship is developed. Before we go into a study of kinship in India, the theoretical basis of how kinship in India has been understood and developed is important to further go into the analysis of ideas such as the joint family, of cross-cousin marriage, and of something we are all familiar with such as arranged marriage, love marriage, and dowry systems. Believe it or not, all these systems are actually linked to our understanding of kinship and family. what we do today in terms of our modern relationships can also be linked to theoretical analysis. It is not that we are only talking in abstractions, but that these abstractions are linked to how we live our lives today. A circle and a triangle are not just a circle and a triangle, but modes of thinking through our social relationships. Interestingly, in Patricia Oberoy's volume on kinship, family and marriage in India, the only and perhaps the most seminal volume on kinship in India, she starts discussing how kinship and family in India came to be developed. She lists three important theoreticians, Louis Henry Morgan, W.H.R. Rivers and Claude Lévi-Strauss, as the three important theoreticians who influenced the study of kinship and family in India. Now, W.H.R. Rivers and Louis Henry Morgan studied particular societies. Henry Morgan actually studied the American Indians, and W.H.R. Rivers, a Cambridge anthropologist, studied African societies. But the importance of their conceptualization was to impact how we think of social relationships. You have to understand that earlier in the study of kinship and family, a universal theory was important to develop what was to come later. This brings me to an important differentiation that must be discussed in looking at kinship and family, that of anthropology and sociology. For many of you listening into the lecture today, you must be bemused at this particular distinction. If you're asked about anthropology, many people believe that anthropology is the study of primitive human beings and primitive cultures. Many link anthropology to the study of archaeology as well. However, for the purpose of our study here, it's important to know that anthropology is divided into three particular branches. If you look at universities abroad and in India, universities abroad identify three levels of anthropology. One, sociocultural anthropology. Second, physical anthropology. And the third is biological anthropology. Physical anthropology and biological anthropology often link up with archaeology, but sociocultural anthropology is particularly important to what we are studying today. Sociocultural anthropology, which began with the study of other cultures, is what we also link up to sociology. However, there is a critical difference between these two disciplines. Sociology in contemporary India is the study of large communities and social groups, and often uses particular kinds of method. So sociology uses survey research and is more quantitative in its orientation, whereas social anthropology, as it is practiced in India and abroad, uses the method known as ethnography. What is ethnography? Ethnography is the system of studying communities and people by participating and observing them in their natural habitat. Habitat is a loosely used term here. What I mean is their own living cultures. Ethnography has been used both as a political tool and as a tool of reaching out and giving information about different societies to different sets of people. Why are we looking at anthropology and sociology when looking at kinship? This is absolutely essential, because the distinction between anthropology and sociology is actually the distinction that marks the study of kinship and family. Kinship, for a long time, had been the basis of study in anthropology. Anthropology began way in the 1800s and was used by colonizers to understand the societies they colonized. In India, anthropology was used by the British to actually develop a power hierarchy with reference to their Indian subjects. This was important in understanding how Indians live, what are their local systems of social interaction, and how do they classify themselves. Thus, anthropology became an important tool of the colonial government to use power against local populations. However, anthropology developed into what it is now. It is still a tool to understand other cultures, but it also carries a different sense and different importance. It carries within it the value of looking at other cultures and how they thrive. The political and racial politics linked to anthropology has disappeared to a large extent, but still continues in other ways. So now we study anthropology and other cultures to understand how other people live and to develop empathy. Ethnography is the primary mode of doing that. and kinship has now become a different mode and study within anthropology. To go back to how anthropology developed the study of kinship, we come to this key question of how and why sociology didn't do it. Now, anthropology and sociology have particular disciplinary trajectories which have marked it in the West and in India. However, for the purpose of our study here, I'll focus on how anthropology and kinship came to be the most important and the most relevant aspect of the study of human culture in the West. So, as I mentioned earlier, two theories, descent and alliance. By descent, if you look at the simple symbol and by what I mentioned earlier, the simple relationship between father and son, and this refers to. Now, this would be identified as patrilineal descent, or one passed down from father to son. However, if I had to change it to mother to daughter, it would be matrilineal descent, or that from mother to daughter. What is the importance of the idea of descent? One of the classical theorists in anthropology, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, who studied descent groups in Africa in the early 1900s, coined and gave a lot of importance to the idea of descent. He actually said that descent forms the bedrock of kinship studies. For him, descent was an idea wherein groups and communities pass down not only property but also name. Ideally, to give you an example, in India, especially in North India, we primarily follow the system of patrilineal descent, where name and property flows down from the father to the son. Of course, legal injunctions have made it possible for daughters to inherit property as well, but that is for another lecture. So, for the purposes of understanding kinship at its very basic level, patrilineal descent involves father to son. The importance of this structure is identified as unilineal descent groups. What does unilineal mean? Unilineal means in one line. It can either be matrilineal or patrilineal. On the other hand, other than unilineal is the idea of bilateral. I am sure you can see this. Bilateral, in opposition to unilineal, refers to descent which follows both on the mother's and the father's line. This is very interesting. There are many societies that follow it, and ideally Western societies are known to follow a bilateral system of descent. What does bilateral mean? Bilateral means perhaps and maybe name follows from one side and property follows from the other. It can be in variation and it can be dependent on societies. But bilateral means that both lines have equal importance. In the unilineal system, however, one line has importance. And in that one line, everything follows: power, prestige, name, property, right? So, on the basis of this basic idea of the unilineal descent group, Radcliffe Brown actually developed a whole system of analysis of African societies. One of the most important ideas that he discussed was that of the joking relationship. The joking relationship, very simply put, is a relationship that kin of different generations may share based on warmth, affection, and a ribaldry or a kind of familiarity which they may not share with others of different generations. To give you an example, grandparents and grandchildren have joking relationships. You have a very warm relationship with your grandparents indulge you, you joke with them, you have a little bit of a back and forth. That is one relationship. The other very common joking relationship in North India is between the Devar and the Bahu. So, the sister-in-law and the younger brother-in-law will have this camaraderie where they do not necessarily follow a locational idea of power. You may not have the same relationship with your father or your mother for that matter. Ideally, a child and a father follow generational rule of power, especially in a patrilineal system. To further elaborate Radcliffe-Brown's theory, the joking relationship, according to Radcliffe-Brown, was embedded within a structural functional logic, basically that the joking relationship emerged from a descent system. In Africa, he found mothers, brothers, or what is commonly known as mama in North India. Mama and bhanja, or the mother's brother and the sister's son, share a very affectionate, joking relationship. The nephew will joke to his uncle, the uncle will also joke back, they will share, they will tease each other. It's very comfortable, it's very warm. Based on this idea, Radcliffe-Brown said that the mama or the mother's brother in Africa is actually a symbol and an idea of the male mother. What does that mean? That means that the relationship that the child shares with the mother in a patrilineal descent group is also similar and transposed to that of the mama. Basically, that the matrilineal group here, your mother's group, provides support against a more hierarchical system that you might have with your father's group, which is seen interestingly in the relationship that a child might share with the father's sister. The father's sister, or what is commonly known in North India as the Bua, is more authoritarian, more strict, more dominating, because she resembles the father. She represents the father's group. So the father's sister is also known as the female father. This interesting juxtaposition of relationships is, according to Radcliffe-Brown, a reminder of the structural idea of descent. So in a matrilineal descent group where mother passes down power, name and property to the daughter, this is reversed. Your mother's brother becomes an authoritarian and strict figure, whereas your father's sister is the more affectionate and warm person, because power is concentrated on the mother's line. How does this make sense? It makes very important sense when we look at African information to then reflect on how Indian ideas of kin work. This is also seen within Indian kinship. In North India, you're not going to contest that the mama is someone you're closer to. The mama participates in all your life cycle rituals, is supposed to help you out when you're in need, and is closer to you just like you're closer to your mother because of the patrilineal system. In South India, for instance, the mama is someone you marry. You may not have an affectionate relationship, but he is a possible spouse, showing a different kind of structural principle. We will come to North India and South India later, but for the time being, I thought this was an important example to introduce to you the idea of how descent and intimate relationships work. Now, the idea of descent works very well when thought of in terms of kinship relations and the idea of how intimate relationships may be structured by a particular line. However, the descent theory has its limitations. It juxtaposes and puts a lot of emphasis on descent and intimacy and on the unit of the single individual. For a long time in anthropology, Radcliffe-Brown's theory was very, very important. However, the only and the biggest turnover from Radcliffe-Brown's theory was brought by Claude Lévi-Strauss when he wrote the seminal volume, The Elementary Structures of Kinship. The elementary structures of kinship actually changed the theoretical and anthropological idea of kinship. He brought through the most important idea within the study of kinship, which is known as alliance. Alliance or marriage was for Lévi-Strauss the basis of how kin relationships are made. To alliance theory that Lévi-Strauss coined, simply put, this is a sign of marriage. Man, marriage, woman. But what does this sign do to relationships? Let's see. Now let's look at the particular symbols and their meanings here. If we designate, Suppose this is you. Now this is very important. In anthropological theory, you have to always identify the locus of a kin group. This triangle is you. I'm taking it as male and I'm identifying it as the ego or the self. Now for the ego, the father is this triangle and the mother is this circle. And this is the ego's sister. Please see carefully. Father's F, mother's M, but sister is Z. Now this is another part of kinship theory which is very important. Why is the sister Z and not S? Because S is also the son. So you have to designate a different symbol and a different idea for the sister. Therefore, the letter Z. Everything else follows as per the first letter. So wife is W, daughter is D, husband is H, and brother is B. Why are we dabbling in these word symbols? Because Levi-Strauss makes these symbols and words essential to the study of kinship. He develops what is later known as a pseudo-algebra, an algebra which is not mathematical but involves looking through logical ideas of how kinship is framed. For Levi-Strauss, the idea of alliance is critical to understanding kinship. For him, unlike Radcliffe Brown, the equal to sign and that of marriage means that that forms the basis of society. Unlike Radcliffe Brown, who said that the mother's brother is the male mother and that is because of this descent line from the father to the son, Levi-Strauss says that the mother's brother is important because he has given his sister in marriage to the boy's father, to your father. Not so simple, I'll explain. The whole idea of alliance in kinship theory depends on the most critical intervention by Levi-Strauss, the idea of nature and culture. Nature and culture becomes a very important way in which kinship negotiates the idea of biology and society. What is biology for kinship? Biology for kinship is sexual procreation or the act of having children, something you can't negotiate with. The only way children are born is through sexual procreation, and that forms the bulwark of kinship in anthropology. Once you have taken that for granted, everything else must build up on that, right? So the act of having children is not just the act of having sex and giving birth. The act of having children is to make kin, and making kin therefore must follow certain rules, right? So if we look at this particular diagram, for instance, for Levi-Strauss, if your mama had not given your mother to your father, you would not have been born. As simple as that. This means that marriage, alliance and exchange are absolutely fundamental to society. Now, how does marriage come into being? Were we just born in a state of marriage, or was it something that was brought through? Here, Levi-Strauss makes a critical injunction. He develops the idea of the incest taboo and the idea of marriage. We all know what incest means. Incest means sexual relationships between family members. Why is incest taboo? Why don't we have sexual relationships within the family? To facilitate, according to Levi-Strauss, the idea of marriage. So one of the things that works in favor of marriage is the taboo over sexual relationships amongst kin. To develop this idea further, Levi-Strauss begins with the question, why is incest taboo a universal rule? It is a universal rule. Across cultures, by and large, incest or sexual relations amongst close kin is not allowed, is looked down upon, is actually leads to horrifying ideas of transgressing boundaries. So what does incest taboo, and where does the taboo emerge from? Does it emerge from nature, or is it a social rule? And that is a critical question that Levi-Strauss asks. Is taboo and incest linked together in nature itself, or is it a more important cultural rule? The most important thing with incest taboo is that it is a social rule made to control a natural instinct. Levi-Strauss discusses 2 or 3 theories to discuss this and the emergence of the incest taboo. The first, by Westermarck and, by Havelock and Ellis, looks at how the incest taboo comes through the horror and contempt of near relationships. You must have heard of the saying, familiarity breeds contempt, meaning people you are close to, you are never attracted to. For Westermarck, this is the theory that defines the incest taboo. People you grow up with, people who are your close kin, there is a natural tendency to not want to have sex with them. There is a sense of horror attached to it. However, this is a theory which is fleeting and not totally developed. There is another theory which suggests that psychologically you are framed in such a way that you don't want to have intimate relations with your kin. But for Levi-Strauss, the most important theory regarding incest taboo is that of the sociological theory. And Emile Durkheim, one of the most important sociologists, influences Levi-Strauss's look at the incest taboo. The idea of the incest taboo draws from this notion that sociologically speaking, no society can thrive unless it meets other people and marries out. If you continuously marry within your own family or have sexual relations within your own family, then society will remain stuck within that particular idea of a unit. It has to spread, and social relations have to spread for people to meet other people and for society to become a community. The incest taboo provides the first element of this by encouraging exchange in marriage. Durkheim says that the fear in primitive and ancient societies, the fear of the pollution induced by the menstrual blood of kin women during sex was one of the fears against incest taboo. He also mentions that for societies to come together and socialize, the incest taboo was important to facilitate the exchange of women. We now enter into the most important theoretical idea that Claude Levi-Strauss speaks about, the exchange of women. For Levi-Strauss, incest taboo is the essential rule to facilitate exchange in marriage. In primitive societies, not only were goods exchanged, but women were also exchanged between groups. It was important for women to marry into each other's groups to facilitate social interaction. As I said earlier, the mother's brother or your mama has to give your mother to another man for you to be born. So the exchange was between men of women to facilitate not only the birth of future generations, but to facilitate interaction. The exchange of women becomes a very important and motive issue within the study of kinship. It is very volatile and is later critiqued, as we will discuss, by the feminist scholar Gail Rubin. But for the purposes of Levi-Strauss's analysis, the alliance theory becomes important to understand how cultures across the world mediate the idea of the biology of sex to make kinship and kin. Let us look at three very important ideas within that of alliance and marriage. We have just discussed incest taboo. The other idea that is critical to our analysis is that of the marriage of cousins. What is the marriage of cousins? Do we immediately start exchanging women with other groups? Let us imagine a primitive society where there is only one group, but they must marry outside their immediate kinship group so as not to incur incest, to be able to fulfill the requirements of the incest taboo. How do you do this? You marry your cousin. There are two kinds of marriage rules: cross cousin and parallel cousin. Who are your cross cousin? Cousins linked to you either through any cousin linked to you through the opposite sex. So your mother's brother's children would be your cross cousin, and your father's sister's children would be your cross cousin. I hope that makes sense. The parallel cousin, on the other hand, are those belonging to your parents' same-sex siblings. So your father's brother's children, and your mother's sister's children. Parallel cousin marriage, interestingly, is followed in many Islamic societies, but not as much in India amongst Hindu society. Parallel cousin marriage was also chronicled less in Levi-Strauss's study. What is the most common form of marriage is the cross cousin. The cross cousin marriage means, interestingly, that every time a mother's brother or your mama gives your mother in marriage to your father must reciprocate by giving his sister in marriage to your mama. It's an interesting idea, but theoretically it means that two groups continue in a relationship which is long term. They invest in each other and they have children who invest in each other over a period of time. Parallel cousin marriages, though rare, also have their significant importance. The idea of marrying cousins is to continue within the same family line, but also to create a sense of kinship that continues over time. Here, marriage becomes preferential or prescriptive. Cross cousin marriage is preferential, meaning preferred, ideal, positive. Parallel cousin marriage may be prescriptive, not always allowed or preferred, but in cases of the unavailability of the correct spouse, something that you fall back on. The cross cousin marriage exchange became the immediate mode of analysis for Levi-Strauss. He developed a large theory around this to actually discuss further how nature, biology, mediates with culture. So while there is the incest taboo, there is also the marriage of cousins. Both talk together to create universal rules, to manage natural instincts, and to build on the idea of kin. I will now show. So when we look at cross cousin marriage, the most common type of marriage is the one you can see in the diagram, known as matrilateral marriage. What is the matrilateral marriage? In the matrilateral marriage, as you can see, the ego marries the mother's brother's daughter. How does that happen? Let's trace it. There are three groups here, A, B, and C. The ego here, if we had to chart how this person is the mother's brother's daughter, the ego's father is right here. The ego's mother is right here. This is the mother's brother who is married to someone here, and this is the mother's brother's daughter. Very simple really, but takes time to think about. Interestingly, as you can see in this diagram, A is giving women to B and B is giving women to C. This is also known as asymmetrical exchange. Why is it known as asymmetrical exchange? Because they are not giving back to each other. It always follows in a single line. A gives to B, B gives to C, and at some point C might give back women to A. It's never that A will give to B and B will give back to A. That doesn't work. This is a simple mode of marriage exchange that defines how groups interact with each other. As you can see, wife givers and wife takers becomes an important point here. So A are wife givers to B, B are wife givers to C. C may be wife givers to A, but for the time being, C is a wife taker from B and B is a wife giver, wife taker from A. Why are we making these very important ideological assumptions about marriage? This, according to Levi-Strauss, is the basic structure of how exchange works in society. This is a universal format. Of course, in every society, marriage differs. There are different forms and permutations of marriage. In India itself, according to the variety of regions, languages, cultures, castes, and religions, marriage itself is very, very varied. But to understand the variety, according to Levi-Strauss, we must have a foundational idea of how marriage works. This is the foundation. For Levi-Strauss, this is also known as unconscious structures. To read more about Levi-Strauss and the idea of structuralism, the elementary structures of kinship is a good starting point. So, the matrilateral cross-cousin marriage has the basic idea that the ego or the male ego will marry his mother's brother's daughter. However, when we go further, we see another different kind of setup. This is known as the patrilateral cross-cousin marriage. Here, ego marries his father's sister's daughter. How? We shall see. Ego's mother is here, father is here, and this is father's sister. This diagram is the bilateral cross cousin marriage. As we saw in the matrilateral case, a minimum of 3 groups are required to facilitate the marriage of the ego with the mother's brother's daughter. In the bilateral cross cousin marriage, 2 groups are more than enough. So, there is A and there is B. The interesting thing here is that the ego will marry someone who's both his mother's brother's daughter and father's sister's daughter. How does that happen? We will see how. So, ego's father, who is married to his mother, is also related to this person, who is interestingly related to this person. As you can see in this particular generation, let us say you are the ego, your father has married your mother and your mama has married your bua. It is an interesting setup. I apologize for using North Indian terminology, but this is to facilitate easier understanding. So, within the same 2 groups, they are exchanging women amongst themselves. 2 brothers exchanging their sisters, right? So, A gives to B and B gives back to A. This is known as symmetrical marriage exchange. It is symmetry that defines it. Generation after generation, A will give to B and B will give back to A. Therefore, leading to the ego marrying a woman who is also, if you follow this link, mother's brother's daughter and father's sister's daughter. Isn't it interesting? This model was actually found by Levi-Strauss among certain Australian tribes, namely the Carrera and the Aranda. From 2, they can also become 4 and 8 groups. But the idea is that they always exchange in the same generation and at the same time. It is not delayed like in matrilateral cross cousin marriage, and it is not asymmetrical, it is symmetrical. Also highlighting that wife givers and wife takers are equal. This is significant. Those who give women and those who take women do it at the same time, creating a sense of equality and symmetry. So, when we look at this whole idea of the cross cousin marriage, 2 or 3 important things emerge. 1, that you exchange women. 2, that the incest taboo is essential to facilitate marriage. 3, that wife givers and wife takers are particular classes of people. Please remember that this distinction between wife givers and wife takers then follows us into the study of India and kinship in India. This impacts the way we think about kinship in India and marriage in India, because in India, wife givers and wife takers are of a particular class and they involve certain relationships amongst themselves. So, please remember this basic idea that Levi-Strauss is telling you. Though this book was written in the early 40s and 50s, the idea of the elementary structures of kinship was to give you tools to understand kinship. It may not follow the same system, but the idea is to understand how we think about relationships. Moving on from Levi-Strauss, the most important critique therefore that emerges for Levi-Strauss's theory, which for a long time was the predominant theory, is by the sociologist and feminist scholar Gail Rubin. Gail Rubin finds Levi-Strauss's use of women as tools of exchange as most critical and something that theorists don't look at. She asks us to look at theory, to understand it and to critique it. For us, the mode that kinship is okay as long as women are being exchanged is deeply problematic. For her, there is no reflection on how Levi-Strauss is stuck on the mode of looking at women as only and only objects, that women have no voice and no agency, but form the bulwark of the first form of exchange, even before barter came in. It's women who are exchanged. For Rubin, that is hugely problematic. For her, it is problematic because this kind of rhetoric forms the basis for kinship studies to come. And it did influence kinship studies for many decades before feminist scholarship through Gail Rubin and others like Sylvia Yanagisako and Jane Collier offered a seminal critique of people like Levi-Strauss and Radcliffe Brown and another sociologist, anthropologist, D.M. Schneider. But for the purposes at hand, Rubin's critique develops the idea that we have to look at kinship more critically and not just stick with models and diagrams that provide us with an overview or a mirage of how society exists and does not delve deeper into the inequalities that might be inherent in such theoretical conceptualization. Continuing with Gail Rubin's critique of Levi-Strauss, besides the idea that in Levi-Strauss's theory, the idea that women are exchanged is deeply and fundamentally problematic, rendering women as objects. The other theoretical idea that Gail Rubin actually propounds is the notion that through the linkage of cross cousins, there is an implicit idea of heterosexuality, that you must marry with your mother's brother and not with your mother's sister. Your mother's brother's children and your father's sister's children, though implicit and taken for granted, also includes the idea that only the cross sex can facilitate marriage and alliance and not the same sex. It doesn't mean fostering homosexuality, but it means that heterosexuality becomes a social norm that has to be pushed for. Moving on, we look at now the first development of Indian sociology and anthropology and its foundational study of kinship and marriage. Here I would like to begin with the sociologist Iravati Karve's idea of the kinship map of India. It's an interesting concept that she developed to look at how linguistic divisions in India can also collaborate and corroborate to a larger definition of kinship and family. What is this notion of the kinship map of India? She divides India into two parts, the Indo-Aryan and Dravidian. The Indo-Aryan stretches from North India, from Rajasthan to the north and to West Bengal, leaving out the northeast, which has its own specific kind of kinship organization. And the Dravidian kinship system stretches through the south. Madhya Pradesh and the central part of India remains not conceptualized in Karve's analysis. What is the interesting thing about Indo-Aryan kinship? It involves three very primary important rules: hypergamy, rules of marriage, and spatial limits to marriage. What is important here is that marriage becomes the defining criteria of distinguishing between Indo-Aryan and Dravidian marriage. What is hypergamy? Hypergamy is the marriage of two partners belonging to two different sets in society, inferior and superior. There are two variants to hypergamy. Hypogamy refers to a woman belonging to an upper section of society, class, caste, either way, marrying a man belonging to a lower class or caste. Hypergamy usually is followed where a man of a higher section marries a woman of a lower section, class or caste. In India and in North India especially, hypergamy is most usually followed. Hypogamy is not followed at all and is often looked down upon socially. It leads to ostracization of the woman and their children. Similarly, spatial limits to marriage refers to how in North Indian marriage systems, the girl must always be married outside her village and neighborhood. This is a critical difference because when we look at Dravidian kinship and the way Iravati Karve discusses it, Dravidian kinship comes across as completely different. Dravidian kinship, on the other hand, has a system where spatial limits exist in terms of the same neighborhood and most importantly, the wife givers are equal to the wife takers. This is Dravidian and this is Indo-Aryan. Taking from Levi-Strauss, this is an important difference because in case of North Indian kinship, wife givers are not equal to wife takers. In North Indian kinship, by and large, those who give women in marriage are inferior to those who take women in marriage. This is embodied in the rule of the Kanyadan, where the father gives his daughter in marriage along with dowry to the boy and to the boy's family because they are superior to them. This ideology, of course, is hugely problematic, but forms the bedrock of North Indian kinship. Whereas in Dravidian kinship, interestingly, the equality between the wife giver and the wife taker is based on the simple principle that they exchange women together. Remember bilateral marriage? It's the same principle. In many parts of South India, women marry their mama or their mother's brother. It is a reversal of the same exchange that the mother's brother did with his sister to the girl's father. A reciprocity of the exchange happens over generations. This is a very simplistic view of South Indian marriage. We will discuss the details and the varieties in it, but to give you a sense of how the inequality between wife givers and wife takers impacts these two systems is critical. Thus, the notion of marrying up and down becomes very, very important in North India. So does the marriage of women within and outside the neighborhood or the village. In South India, by dint of marrying your own mother's brother, you often come to reside in the same neighborhood as your mother and father. Whereas in North India, because you're marrying into superior and inferior classes, it's always preferred that the girl marry outside the village or the neighborhood, that she must be sent away. A part of this logic of the wife giver wife taker relationship means that often girls are understood and modeled on the lines of the ideology of the pariah dhan, something we have heard of so much, because the girl is she has borrowed money, she must be returned to her owner, who's usually the husband and his kin group. This sort of ideology also means that a girl remains inferior to the whole setup of the family and kinship system. Whereas in Dravidian systems, women are not that they're not inferior or superior, but that the marriage exchange treats a woman equally, as much as her husband and his kin. This is important in creating different sorts of ideologies. But the most important thing about Karve's ideology and her division of society in India in terms of marriage rules is that she herself makes certain outstanding problematic distinctions. The first, the division based on Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, is also a racial difference. It's not only linguistic, but carries with it certain ideas which are archaic. Indo-Aryan carries with it an earlier colonial idea that the north is occupied by a certain racial group, whereas Dravidian carries with it certain other archaic ideas. We will be decimating all these other ideas as we go along in this course, but for the time being, one must understand classical theory to be able to critique it and decimate it properly. As we go along to the end of this course, of this first lecture, I would like to introduce one final idea, that of fictive kin. We have spoken of blood and marriage as the essential bulwark of kinship. What is fictive kin? Fictive kin is based on the idea of fiction and also based on the idea of how relationships other than blood and marriage are also important to understand how kinship and marriage exist. Fictive kin developed by many of the anthropologists to understand what is beyond blood and marriage actually is an interesting category that further becomes important as we can come to the contemporary study of kinship and marriage. What is fictive kin? The anthropologist Julian Pitt Rivers draws the idea of fictive kin from the idea of fiction or anything that's not real. Now, what is real? Is real only blood and marriage? It seems so. Julian Pitt Rivers actually looks at particular types of kin to understand what fictive means. The three types of kin that he discusses: the first, those who are joined together or have relations through clubs or membership to particular associations. One of the examples here is of a study of the blood brotherhood in Africa. The blood brotherhood consists of young boys who are initiated together. The use of blood is important here. While we use blood to identify kin, it's also used as an important tool to make kin amongst those who are not traditionally kin. But what is this idea that marks fictive? Therefore, fictive kinship, according to Julian Pitt-Rivers, mimics the real deal. This is seen in adoption and fosterage, where when you adopt a child, you try to present the child in terms of a biological idiom of blood and relationship, at the same time maintaining the difference of adoption and fosterage. This is again critical. Similarly, in what Julian Pitt-Rivers calls spiritual kinship, that shared between in Christianity between the godfather and the godchild, or also known as godparenthood, is also a relationship that is again replicated in case of something in India, for instance, the Guru-Shishya relationship. The Guru-Shishya relationship is particular because it's not one traditionally understood as kin, but one based on respect, training and skill, something that is more important than one you share with your parents. Because often within Indian culture, the Guru is as close as a person can get to parenthood. Guru-Shishya also mimics blood relationships, kinship, but cannot be the real deal. However, and this is critical, fictive kinship in contemporary studies of kinship have led to questioning what is real and what is unreal. When we look at blood and marriage, is that truly real kinship or is everything else real? Let me give you a small example. When you go out to buy vegetables or go to your close storekeeper or take a public transport, the use of the word bhaiya is very important. It is a kin term. Bhaiya refers to a brother, but it is also meant to create a certain kind of fluid fictive kin with a person you don't know. In India, this is commonly practiced. Many of us use kin terms to refer to neighbors, to people we work with, to service providers. Your neighbor is your auntie or your mausi, who may not really be your auntie or mausi, but you refer to them with such terms to create a kind of kinship. Is that kinship untrue? That is something that we look at as we go into details of this study, of this course. Most importantly, I would like to leave you with the idea of the Rakhi Bandhan or Rakhi relationship. Rakhi is a very important relationship practiced in North India, and every year in August and September, many young girls tie a thread of affection and bond with their brothers. This relationship carries with it certain ideas of responsibility, mutual reciprocity and protection. But the Rakhi is often tied by girls to men who they may not be related to, who may not really be their brothers. It is to create a relationship of brotherhood and sisterhood. It is a very cherished relationship, and the tying of the thread is very important in North Indian cultures. Thinking about Rakhi also brings us to the point of thinking about kinship. As we go into this course, we will look at both classical theory, like that of Levi-Strauss. We will look at how North India and South India differ in their understanding of kinship, and we will also understand how these ideas, which were set in stone at some point of time, have been critiqued, developed to bring forth a more nuanced idea of kin and family and marriage, one that involves and invokes different forms of negotiations, not only those of the real or the fake, but of real intimate conversations with people of the same group. Next class, we will bring the study of South Indian kinship and marriage, and we will take it forward to look at North Indian kinship. For now, thank you. See you again.